All right, Phil Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. This is Wednesday, the 6th of January 2021. And today I want to talk about tariffs. Far too many people who want to support the South in the arguments over the Civil War just got the tariff story completely wrong. They're saying 85%, the majority of the tariffs were paid by Southerners. This is not true. The real case that the South has against the protective tariffs is that the protective tariffs made the manufacturing industries, the big ones in the North, domestic monopolies. The purpose of a protective tariff is not to raise revenue. They don't want anyone to pay the protective tariff fees. They want the protective tariff to be so high that people will buy the domestic good instead of importing. Again, protective tariffs are not designed to raise revenue. They are designed to block competition. Prior to the Civil War, the three largest industries north of the Ohio River and the Mason-Dixon line were cotton textile manufacturing, iron products, and woolen textile manufacturing. All three were protected by high protective tariffs. So what I'm going to get into here is, I'll pull up my notes in a minute, but the arguments you'll find here are in this book, Causes of the Civil War. I wrote it last year. It came out in October 2020, so it's only a few months old, but it was triggered by the fact that we were seeing all the Confederate monuments destroyed, or so many of them destroyed and vandalized and that sort of thing. So I wanted to get the arguments out there that make the case for the South, that don't demonize the South, that make the case for the South defending itself. Causes of the Civil War by Philip Lee. Now, if you want a signed autograph copy, email me, Phil, Phil _ Lee, Leigh, at me.com. That'll be $25, and I will pay the postage here in the United States. If you just want to get a copy, an unsigned copy, you can get it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or many fine bookstores. Causes of the Civil War by Philip Lee. Let me pull up my notes now. During the past 30 years, most modern historians claim that slavery was the overwhelming cause of the Civil War. They increasingly insist that the South's opposition to protective tariffs was a minimal factor, even though such tariffs were specifically outlawed in the Confederate Constitution. One of these modern historians sums up the conventional viewpoint as follows, quote, "One of the most egregious of so-called lost cause narratives suggests that it was not slavery, but a protective tariff that sparked the Civil War. On March 2nd, 1861, the Morrill Tariff was signed into law by outgoing President James Buchanan. And incidentally, he was from Pennsylvania, where iron products was a big factor in their economy. And again, iron products was one of the three biggest manufacturing industries in the United States, was protected by protective tariffs. Now, let me continue with this quote. On March 2nd, 1861, the Morrill Tariff was signed into law by outgoing Democratic President James Buchanan. A pernicious lie quickly formed around the tariff's passage, a lie suggesting that somehow this tariff had caused the U.S. Civil War. By ignoring slavery's central role in precipitating secession and civil war, or precipitating secession and the Civil War, this tariff myth has survived in the United States for more than a century and a half, and it needs to be debunked once and for all. To begin, this is me speaking now. To begin, the academic historian quoted above fails to note that antebellum tariffs accounted for about 90% of federal revenues, even though most of his comrades readily concede this point. Thus, tariff policy, when it's 90% of the revenue for the federal union, tariff policy was almost certain to be an important antebellum issue to all Americans, as a federal tax policy, just as federal tax policy is to us today. Beyond that, the self-described, quote, debunker meaning that academic guy who I just quoted, he falls into three traps that often entangle his fellow McPherson, Blight, and Foner acolytes. First, he equates the causes of secession with the causes of civil war, but they are not the same. The North could have let the initial 7 cotton states leave in peace, as many leaders such as Horace Greeley, Edwin Stanton, and future President Rutherford Hayes were willing to do. There was no danger that the South would invade the North. War came only after the North decided to invade the initial 7 cotton states. Thus, discovering the war's causes requires an analysis of the North's reasons for wanting to coerce the South back into the Union instead of the reasons the South chose to secede. The true goal that prompted Northerners to invade the South was to avoid the economic consequences of disunion, and this is a point that most modern historians do not want to discuss. They ignore it. It's you know what they are? They're like vampires looking in a mirror. They don't see it. Since the Confederate Constitution outlawed protective tariffs, her lower tariffs would concentrate, and here's why it would be damaging to the South. Since the Confederate Constitution, or excuse me, this is why the North wanted to avoid a low tariff country just below their southern border, because of the economic problems it would create for the North. Let me just continue. Since the Confederate Constitution outlawed protective tariffs, her lower tariffs would confront the remaining states of the truncated Union with 2 consequences. First, the federal government would lose much of its tax revenue, since articles imported into the Confederacy would divert tariff revenue from the North to the South. Now, I didn't say most of the tax revenue, or I certainly didn't say the overwhelming majority of this tax revenue would be diverted to the South. No, I'm saying an important part of it, but not the majority of it. Best estimate, 30%. That's a significant minority. Okay, the second, and even this is the second point is even more important. Second, a low Confederate tariff would cause Southerners to buy more manufactured goods from Europe as opposed to the northern states where prices were artificially inflated by protective tariffs. In 1866, for example, the year after the war had ended, when the South was desperately in need of rebuilding its railroads, railroad iron sold for $80 a ton in New York, but it was only $32 a ton in England due to the American protective tariffs that were designed to create manufacturing monopolies in the North. Now, with that kind of a price difference, $80 a ton in New York and $32 a ton in England, there can be no doubt that the protective tariff was keeping a domestic monopoly in power for no other reason than to keep that particular economic interest of the owners and the employees of those factories in power. Second, although most modern historians concede that the South traditionally opposed high tariffs, they argue that the rates were too low in 1861 to provoke a war, even if increased. Such arguments typically compare customs duties in 1860 to the earlier years, but they ignore the steep and protracted rise during and after the war. Nonetheless, the victors' conduct after Appomattox better reveals their true motive for militarily subjugating the South than does the rhetoric that they used before the war. What politicians say is insignificant compared to what they do. You just got to watch what they do, not what they say, because they're always going to use the right words, but you have to watch what they do. That was true then, it's true now. On the eve of the Civil War, rates on dutiable items, and most items imported were dutiable. On the eve of the Civil War, rates on dutiable items averaged 19%. But thereafter, they averaged about 45% until Southern-born Democrat Woodrow Wilson became president 50 years later in 1913. Although Wilson reduced rates, Republicans again increased them after regaining control of the federal government in the 1920s. The GOP did not welcome free trade until after 1945, until after 1945, when the region north of the Ohio and Potomac rivers had virtually no competition anywhere on the globe, since the economies of Europe and Asia had been wrecked by World War II. They saw an opportunity after World War II. The economies north of the Ohio River and the Mason-Dixon line, that they could be the sole source for the entire world of manufactured goods. And now all of a sudden they want tariffs reduced. Detroit wants to be able to sell automobiles in Africa, Japan, everywhere. Everywhere. And when those countries put up tariffs, like Japan, to to foster growth of their own domestic industries, our people in America wanted those tariffs reduced so that Detroit could sell cars everywhere. Third, modern historians generally fail to consider the adverse impact of import tariffs on domestic industries that export most of their output. And this is another key point that is missed over and over and over again in the arguments over tariffs. Tariffs not only inflated the cost of imported goods and fostered the growth of domestic monopolies of manufacturing industries in the North, they hurt the sales of exports, particularly the sales of exported commodities. They hurt those. They caused them to have lower prices and lower volumes. Let me explain. There is no better example than American cotton, which normally exported 75% of its crop annually when the Civil War started. The dominant buyers were Great Britain and France, which typically obtained the exchange credits needed to buy American cotton by selling finished manufactured goods to the United States. In other words, to get the dollars they need to buy Southern cotton, they got to be able to sell manufactured goods into the United States, right? But high protective tariffs made it difficult for European manufacturers to sell their goods competitively in America, as noted in the railroad iron example above. If the tariffs are so high that they're $32 a ton, railroad iron has to sell for $80 a ton, how much of that are they going to be able to export, to the United States? So how are they going to generate the dollars they need to buy Southern cotton? It's a good question, which modern historians almost never discuss. Never. This is something they ignore. It's as invisible to them as a vampire in the mirror. This had two consequences for the American South. One was to motivate European cotton buyers to seek new feedstock sources outside the United States. Thus, high domestic import tariffs invited other countries to compete with American cotton. Notable examples include Egypt, India, and Brazil. The second consequence was to force the European to buy less American cotton than they might otherwise do, and thereby shrinking the market for Southern farmers. The consequences lasted at least 70 years after the war. When commenting upon a multi-year decline in cotton exports in 1935, for example, Assistant Treasury Secretary Oscar Johnston wrote, quote, "The major cause of the decline is the inability of the foreign consumers to obtain American exchange credits, meaning dollars," close quote. Southern farmers needed export markets, but what they got were American tariffs that drove overseas cotton buyers to seek to buy cotton from other countries. In reality, the myth that needs debunking is that the North went to war to end slavery instead of to avoid the economic consequences of disunion. The myth is that they were nobly wanting to end slavery, whereas in reality, they wanted to avoid the economic consequences of disunion. You don't believe me? Well, consider two things. Here is how the Boston Transcript, which was a major newspaper at the time, analyzed the situation in an editorial less than 1 month before the opening shots at Fort Sumter. Alleged, this is quoting the newspaper now, Boston Transcript, March 1861. Alleged grievances in regard to slavery were originally the causes for separation of the cotton states, but the mask has been thrown off. It is apparent that the people of the seceding states are now for commercial independence. The merchants of New Orleans, Charleston, and Savannah are possessed with the idea that New York, Boston, and Philadelphia may be shorn of their mercantile greatness by a revenue system verging on free trade. If the Southern Confederation is allowed to carry out a policy by which only a nominal duty is laid upon imports, no doubt the businesses of the chief northern cities will be seriously injured. The difference is so great between the tariff of the Union and that of the Confederacy that the entire Northwest, meaning the present day Midwest, must find it to their advantage to purchase imported goods at New Orleans rather than New York. In addition, Northern manufacturers will suffer from the increased importations resulting from the low duties in the South. Well, there you have it. Those are the words of a contemporary newspaper at the time. I get sometimes an argument from those that, I say, well, the tariff stayed up for average 19% before the war, 45% for the next 50 years. I say, well, that's immaterial. You can't say that's a cause of the war because that's evidence that comes after the war. Oh yeah, they love to say that. But then ask them, then they'll go on and they'll argue that it was really all about racism because look how the South continued to be racist well into the 1950s and 60s. Ah, that's different, see? Okay. For Civil War Chat, this is Phil Lee. Thanks for watching.